troubled youths? That's the NES's stock and trade, baby. It's NES Works episode 99. This week, Konami's US branch, Ultra Games, releases its second title by channeling the spirit of Ben Franklin by way of Trip Hawkins with Skater Die.
But wow, how far had the ball for calls for liberty fallen in 200 years? From Live Free or Die to Skater Die. Have some standards, 80s kids. Then again, we 80s kids were used to suffering. We were used to playing games in and inspired by Epyx's Summer Games series. Games like this one. Listen, life was tough for the original Latchkey kids. Our parents' generation was off hoarding all the world's resources for themselves while leaving us home alone to watch G.I. Joe and He-Man and devour junk food, only to make us feel guilty about getting overweight as our heads were filled with Satanism and violence or whatever. Skater Die is a perfect emblem of that era. Skateboarding is great physical activity that hones balance, reflexes, and spatial perception, but helicopter parents hated it because it could lead to broken bones or, worse, hooliganism. So instead, a generation of children sat around their televisions pretending to skateboard rather than just being allowed to go out and do the actual thing. A poor substitute. Anyway, thanks for attending my generational pity party. Yes, Skater Die feels very much like a project derived from Epyx's award-winning games series. Specifically like a hyper-focused version of California Games that focuses entirely on skateboarding. The singular emphasis here works in Skater Die's favor, though this title does still suffer from the game series' greatest weakness, the fact that every single event features its own unique control modality and presents players with different objectives, many of which aren't even clearly laid out in the manual, which makes for a fairly obtuse game. As with Epyx's creations, you'll enjoy some and struggle with others. Now, the games series wasn't inherently bad, but as we've seen on multiple platforms now, it just doesn't work as well in a console context as it did in its original computer incarnations. Visual, animation, and content compromises have greatly diminished the likes of Winter Games on NES and 7800 compared to their Commodore 64 source versions. Skater Die thankfully has the benefit of Konami talent powering its NES conversion. Though published under the Ultra Games label, Skater Die's code comes to us direct from the fiery forges of Konami's internal studios. It lacks the Konami house style for many of its graphics, in that there are no lanky blank-faced running men and emphasis on grayscale monochrome objects here, but it performs smoothly and sounds incredible. It even effectively translates Hubbard's Euro-style demo scene soundtrack into something recognizable, despite running on the inferior NES sound chip. It's just as you'd expect from Konami. Ultra Games, of course, served as Konami's label for games specifically targeted at the US market. Although it's probably best remembered for Metal Gear and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, two original Konami creations that also saw release on Famicom, the majority of Ultra releases would be conversions of Western-developed computer and arcade games, such as Defender of the Crown, Q*bert, and Sid Meier's Pirates. That tradition really begins here, as Skater Die hails from Electronic Arts, who at this point in history still focused its efforts primarily on home computers. As far as I'm able to determine, EA wouldn't actually enter the console publishing space under its own name until 1990 with, as it happens, Skater Die 2. So, for the moment, Konami and Ultra do the heavy lifting here while Trip Hawkins sat back and raked in a pile of cash for lending his company's property to the little guy. Even if the gameplay is about as uneven as you'd expect from this genre, Skater Die offers a tidy little slice of pop culture from the Gleaming the Cube era. The spray can graffiti aesthetic, the neon colors, the wild hairstyles, the goofy pseudo-surfer lingo, it's all very late 1980s in a campy, fun way. Heck, the game's primary interface consists of a skate shop where a guy named Radical Rodney, a dead ringer for lovable bug-eyed loser comedian Rodney Dangerfield, talks you through the details. The skate shop gets you rolling with a cursor-driven interface, the first ever NES interpretation of input seemingly intended for mouse-based control, which allows you to look at high scores, look at shop paraphernalia for color commentary, and head to the pavement to take part in the competitions. Leaving the shop takes you to a second menu screen metaphor, that multimodal kitchen sink approach to design and action, in which you can skate around a small neighborhood to take part in different events. Skater Die offers a total of 5 competitions, plus one combined mode that encompasses all the other events. Nothing here will blow your hair back, but the challenges fall more on the interesting and playable end of the spectrum than something like the arbitrary non-games and Konami's hypersports. Joust feels like the most cutting-edge concept for the era. 2 skaters hurtle up and down the walls of an empty swimming pool while attempting to knock their competitor on their ass with a padded stick. The controls and reactions are a little tricky to master because of course they are, but this feels like a prelude to American Gladiators, which would debut on television less than a year after this release. You have race mode in which you try to outskate one of the game's handful of named NPCs, Bionic Lester. This event feels pretty limited by the fact that it always has you racing the same opponent down the same dangerous alleyway rather than ever mixing things up, but it's reasonably entertaining. More so than Downhill Jam, a surprisingly technical and frustrating obstacle course. And then there are the dud events, High Jump and Freestyle. The former sees you attempt to do a high jump, a very track and field kind of event. When Freestyle gives you 5 passes through a half pipe to perform tricks at the peak of your jump, which you do by pressing buttons in an arbitrary fashion. All in all, it's a bit slight in terms of content, but that seems to have been par for the course for these sporty minigame collections, so by contemporary standards I suppose Skater Die merits existing. If nothing else, the console version plays better than anything in the Epyx Games line, which I suppose was the point. All these comparisons I've dropped to summer, winter, and California games didn't really come up by accident. Although in-depth retrospectives on Skater Die's development don't really appear to exist online, from what I can glean based on a bit of print-only coverage in Retro Gamer magazine, EA hired former Epyx staff to create Skater Die in the shape of the work those devs had done on the game's series. As previously covered in Game Boy Works Gaiden, Atari infamously did Epyx dirty when they acquired the manufacturing rights to Lynx. By squeezing the console creators and their collaborators with a series of bad faith milestone requirements, Atari Corp essentially wrested control of the platform from Epyx and sent the smaller company into destitution. So Electronic Arts, which back in the 80s still took its remit as a home for creative artists seriously, reached out to some of Epyx's talent and said, "Hey, do that stuff you used to do for us." And the result was Skater Die, which Konami then converted to NES and published under the Ultra banner. Anyway, speaking of Atari doing people dirty, that brings us to our next game.
Meanwhile, computer publisher Mindscape makes its NES publishing debut with the home conversion of an arcade game that is also about troubled American youths on wheels. Sure, Paperboy looks like a Norman Rockwell painting, but down inside, this is the paper root of all evil.
We've already seen Paperboy adaptations on Game Boy, Lynx, and Super NES, but all of those games came after this NES conversion. And I suspect none of those ports would have happened if not for the fact that this cartridge became a massive hit. I don't know why precisely, but this rendition of the Atari arcade game sold more than 1 million copies in the US, and according to series creator John Solwitz, became the single most successful iteration of the franchise. Paperboy has a solid legacy across the board. However, this cartridge secured it as an all-timer, as 1 million kids saved up their earnings from their paper routes so they could buy an NES cartridge that let them pretend they were working a paper route. The original coin-op had done pretty well for itself, thanks to its zeitgeisty vibe and memorable cabinet design that allowed players to chuck newspapers from the back of a bicycle by gripping bike handles. As the second release from the post-crash Atari Games offshoot of Atari Inc., following on the heels of the abstract cult favorite Marble Madness, Paperboy had real symbolic meaning. It proved that Atari may have gone through some hard times and come out the other side a changed and broken entity, yet in the end, the people who worked at the company, that had more or less been responsible for making video games into a proper business, still had a lot of clever ideas up their sleeves. While the hardware-based spin-off entity, Atari Corp, was fairly hit or miss and sometimes a bit shady, the software-focused Atari Games would follow up by releasing the groundbreaking likes of Gauntlet and Hard Drivin', and Paperboy helped set the tone for this newly minted company's future. At the same time, this game also feels like a deliberate repudiation for Atari's past. Like Marble Madness, it makes use of a nearly isometric forced projection perspective, simulating a 3D space within the confines of a sprite-based 2D bitmap world. Unlike Marble Madness, it doesn't force players to navigate complex three-dimensional spaces, taking a much simpler approach. Rather than presenting players with a dizzying topographic maze, it simply sends you barreling in one direction, straight ahead, along a residential street. Except it's not really straight ahead, is it? In Paperboy, your bike occupies the bottom corner of the screen as you pedal ahead at a diagonal. This harkens back to Atari Inc.'s 1984 arcade release, The Return of the Jedi. widely considered the least of Atari's renditions of the Star Wars franchise. Compared to the stylish and breezy vector-based shooting of Star Wars in The Empire Strikes Back, Atari's Return of the Jedi felt decidedly mundane. While this isometric setup didn't make for entertaining speeder bike races through the forests of Endor's moon, it worked a lot better as a framing device for delivering newspapers. Paperboy tasks players with pedaling at a leisurely, albeit relentless pace along a suburban street, doing their best to launch newspapers into the yards, porches, and windows of subscribers. While you pedal strictly upward and to the right, you can only toss newspapers to your left. Yes, our Paperboy does not observe sensible traffic safety behavior, and rides his bike on the wrong side of the street, leaving himself vulnerable to traffic that comes barreling along from the opposite direction. The perpendicular relationship between your direction and that of your projectiles maximizes the diagonal nature of the graphics, allowing you to get a glimpse of a much larger chunk of suburban real estate than would be possible with orthogonal bitmaps. The auto-scrolling mechanics, which only allow you to steer to your biker's left and right, also go a long way toward minimizing the cumbersome nature of diagonal controls. Unlike in Qbert or Crystal Castles, you don't need to worry about managing your movement away from the cardinal axes found in most games, because you're always moving forward, no matter what. So even though you can't make use of the arcade's handlebar controllers on NES, the game makes the leap to a D-pad a lot more smoothly than, say, its sibling creation Marble Madness. Anyway, manslaughter-thirsty F-150 drivers are the least of your concerns in Paperboy because this is the most brutal paper route ever. The zoning may look like the HOA-controlled neighborhoods of outer Pasadena, but the residents appear to think they're living in Hell's Kitchen circa 1977. The Paperboy needs to avoid an endless procession of absolutely terrifying neighbors, each driven by their own neuroses. Some appear to engage in public endangerment quite without meaning to, while others seem to have it in specifically for Paperboys. And small wonder, you're not exactly an upstanding pillar of the community yourself. Your newspapers pack a lot of punch, and although your goal is to land a paper in the mailbox of each subscriber on your route, tossing a bundle astray can yield all kinds of interesting interactive results. I'd hazard a guess that this was the true sales appeal of Paperboy. Not the mundane act of pedaling a bike to do a normal job, but being able to commit acts of mayhem that would land you in juvie in the real world. You can stun breakdancers, pacify aggressive stray animals, break windows, and damage lawnmowers. You earn bonus points for causing property damage, and if you manage to deliver to all houses on a block in a single pass, you'll earn a new subscriber, even if you manage to smash out that new subscriber's windows. Of course, this is more easily said than done, since eventually you even have to deal with threats like hostile micro-weather systems, and, inexplicably, Death himself. Paperboy adapts the arcade game quite faithfully to NES, considering the hardware's constraints. Interestingly, this conversion appears to have been handled by Atari's Tengen division, who had self-published under official license from Nintendo as recently as October, yet this version arrives courtesy of publisher Mindscape. If we dig into the newspaper archives, we can get a sense of the events taking shape here. Paperboy arrives on NES the same month that Tengen's parent company, Atari Corp, decided to sue Nintendo for antitrust offenses to the tune of a cool $100 million. Atari's claims certainly weren't entirely unfounded, as Nintendo had begun to use the NES's popularity as leverage to ensure retailers towed the line, while the NES's lockout tech meant third parties needed to operate within the corporation's somewhat arbitrary manufacturing pipeline. Of course, there's more than a little irony here. Atari Corp's precursor, Atari Inc., had attempted to quash independent third parties, like Activision, in court nearly a decade earlier. For double irony, Atari Corp would allegedly use the discovery process for this case to get a look at Nintendo's lockout patents and develop a workaround in order to manufacture unlicensed chips rather than properly reverse engineering a method. Which is to say, Atari exploited its accusation of a crime by Nintendo in order to commit a crime of its own. All of this is a little ways down the road, but suffice it to say that taking someone to court doesn't really make for the most cordial business relationship, and Tengen stopped publishing under license at this point. The following year, Tengen would begin using its illicit knowledge to self-publish the first unauthorized NES carts, but they would also maintain a relationship with Mindscape, a publisher that had specialized in computer software and games to this point. Tengen would eventually branch out and work with other publishers as well, including Jaleco and Konami, with the majority of their NES and Game Boy development output to hit stores with Nintendo's blessing, shipped by way of Mindscape. That relationship would last all the way into 1992 with the NES port of Paperboy 2. Meanwhile, Tengen itself would self-publish a few dozen games in non-standard boxes and carts until shifting its focus to Sega Genesis, and eventually being shut down by the courts over the patent violations committed around this time. Of course, kids playing NES didn't know about any of this. We just knew that there was a game that allowed us to commit acts of domestic chaos that would land us in deep dip in real life, and so this version of Paperboy sold more than 1 million units.
And as always, we must ask ourselves, what did Nintendo Power say?
Not a whole heck of a lot in terms of Paperboy. I got a few little preview blurbs in the very earliest issues of the magazine, but not much else. Skate or Die, on the other hand, enjoyed a reasonable amount of fanfare. Issue 4 of Nintendo Power dedicated a sizable spread to the game, breaking down the play mechanics, showcasing the events and quote-unquote world map, and even providing one of its classic screenshot maps for the downhill race events.
Next time on NES Works, we celebrate episode 100 with a perfect 10 out of 10.